is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories. 3 weeks after taking Kabul, the Taliban announces its acting government. We'll have all the details.
Taliban security forces fire in the air to disperse Kabul protests against the Taliban and Pakistani interference.
Trade boom. China reports record imports and exports, easing fears a shipping shortage would slow economic recovery.
And electric-powered cars stealing the limelight at the World Motor Show in Munich. The Taliban has announced an interim government in Afghanistan, which will be led by one of the group's founders.
People in key positions were named, and they've promised what they've described as an inclusive government that represents the country's complex ethnic makeup, though women are unlikely to be included at top levels.
The announcement of a new government has been expected since the group swept to power and the US-led evacuation was completed at the end of August.
Zamaralai Abbasson joins us now live from Kabul. Talk us through the details then, Zamaralai. What do they mean?
Hello, Paul. Well, finally, the interim government was announced by the Taliban, a long-expected government which would be inclusive. But this is the first step, according to Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid, who had just finished his press conference this evening in Kabul, said that to avoid the void of political stage and also to form the task accordingly, there is a looming situation in regard to the economy of the country, and also a political vacuum is there. So he said that we are announcing the government to finally lead the country. The structure is there is an acting head or chief of the cabinet or the government, Haji Muhammad Hassan, and he will be leading the team. As I got reports, he is still in the UN blacklist, and also he will have two acting deputies, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar and Mullah Hanafi. While there are also some prominent Taliban leaders like Sirajuddin Haqqani as acting minister for Interior Affairs, also Mullah Yaqub as acting minister for defense. And the cabinet is all about the ministers, the deputy ministers, and also some other authorities like the governor for central bank. They'll all be acting and taking care of the government for a short term, according to Zabiullah Mujahid. There's a huge list, 33 people, all of them belong to Taliban member, yet there is no one to take care about the women affairs, yet Zabiullah Mujahid said they will be rapidly including those who are needed in this list of the interim or the take care government. So that's the recent about the government, and of course there are criticism started from now on, and many believe that it's not an inclusive cabinet that the Taliban announced. They are just Taliban members, and all of their senior members will be leading the country. And there is yet international reaction awaited in Afghanistan in the regard of announcement of the interim or take-caring government in Afghanistan.
Zamaralai, on the streets of Kabul, there have been further protests, haven't there?
Yes, Paul, the protests were very much violent in some places. Three main provinces, Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif and Ghor, were witnessing protests from the men and women, and they were chanting different slogans in their demand were focusing on the rights of women, the government structure and the inclusiveness. And while they were on the edge of the protest, also voices about the Panjshir Valley and the resistant force, and then in Mazar-e-Sharif, Taliban opened air firing on the protesters, and there were also violent video which gone viral. Taliban have very violent behavior with the women in some parts, and also in Kabul, the behavior of Taliban was criticized in regard to the arresting of the journalist and also those who were protesting, and then it took about 3 hours that they released the journalist and all who were participating the protest. Yet we have no reports that if there are any detainees in the Taliban presence now or not, but these protests were erupting. Zabihullah Mujahid in his press conference appointed again that this is not a correct time to hold or rally protests in the country because the security situation is alarming. There is no accurate force who should be managing the protests and rallies in the country, and they will be working on this. Also, he emphasized that the journalists and the media should also not cover the protests, and there might be individuals who will misuse the protests and rallies in the country. That's why, according to Zabihullah Mujahid, they have to wait for the accurate time, and they will maintain all the rights of the people of Afghanistan, particularly the women. Paul.
Zamara Light-Aberson, live in Kabul. Thank you.
Professor Michael Semple is from the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast, and he joins us now live. Thanks so much, Dave, for being with us on the programme today. So, details coming through of this new interim government. We now know it'll be led by Mullah Mohammed Hassan Arkhand, with Taliban co-founder Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar as deputy. What do we know about them? What do you think they will be like in those roles?
Well, I should say that the announcement that we've just had is fascinating for Taliban watchers because all the names on the list, including these two that you mentioned at the top, are extremely familiar. Not just to people who have been following the Taliban during the past few years of insurgency, but even to those of us like myself who worked as international officials in Afghanistan between 1996 and 2001. These were the same people who were there then. So we know Mullah Hassan from that period. He was the head of the Council of Ministers from 96 to 2001. He returns to that position. He's got almost no public profile. He's not really, he's not known to people outside the circle of Taliban and Taliban watchers. He's got no experience in politics beyond chairing some meetings beside his fellow Taliban. In terms of Mullah Baradar, I mean, at least over the past 3 years, he's had some exposure to the rest of the country, the rest of the world, apart from Taliban meetings. But I think one of the interesting things about Mullah Baradar is that reality will sink in for people now that the international diplomats thought that they were dealing with a powerhouse inside the Taliban when they sat down with Mullah Baradar and they listened to all his reassurances about how well the Taliban will govern. But now that the Taliban actually have power in their hands, they find that Mullah Baradar is not the top dog. He is at best, he is a second dog. He answers to somebody who is much more conservative, much more hardline than himself.
And another figure I'd like to mention is the new acting Interior Minister who heads up a militant group linked to the Taliban. What do you make of his appointment?
Well, I mean, this really should come as a shock for people who thought that the Taliban were going to go out of their way to form an inclusive administration which would be designed in such a way to deal with the international community. I mean, it's almost a slap in the face for people who were involved in sort of counter-terrorism efforts. Now, that's not just the Americans, that's also the Afghan people. The Khalifa Siraj, who's come in as acting interior minister, he was formerly the coordinator of the suicide operations undertaken by his group. He is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Afghans in suicide bombs directed against civilian targets inside Kabul, as well as hundreds of deaths in international forces who were also separately targeted. And he's not the only person. If you look further down the list, deputy intelligence minister is somebody who was specifically the head of one of the suicide bomber cells, sort of financed and directed by Siraj Haqqani. So to be shifting from running covert camps across the border in Pakistan, be brought into Kabul, now to be running part of the intelligence service is a remarkable transformation. And frankly, it is a deliberate act of provocation. They absolutely know that this will provoke the international community as well as their own people.
Why do you think at this stage this is an announcement of an interim government rather than a full government?
Well, during the Taliban's period in power in the late 90s, they also constituted themselves as an interim government. So I think it's a sensible recognition that this has all been put together very quickly, as was this of the administration that they imposed in the late 90s. So it's I think at least that is a token recognition of what's going on. But there's another very interesting thing about this administration, which perhaps explains why they have announced it as a caretaker. There's no head of state, specifically Mullah Hassan, as was his role in the 1990s. He's head of executive, not the head of state. They're absolutely silent on who's the head of state. Now, in the last time round, the Taliban emir, supposedly rightly guided by God, the emir of all the faithful, then Mullah Umar, he sort of took the role that normally would go to the head of state, whether it be the king, as was in the previous Afghan constitution, or subsequently president. Now, they haven't announced any such position this time, and everybody's noticed that it's 3 weeks after this glorious victory over the former government and the Americans, and nobody has heard or seen anything from the person who's meant to be the supreme leader. So basically, it looks like there's a vacancy at the top of the Taliban movement for the person who would be the head of state. So if you can't even name a head of state, of course your administration has to be acting. But I think that some of the wiser people in the Taliban movement will probably want to put out signals that this is not the end of the story. They have resolutely refused to bring in a single person from outside the movement, so that all the talk about an inclusive administration which might enjoy the support of the population after the war, I mean, that just has come to nothing so far. So I think that they will want to hold out the prospect that maybe in the future, when we get round to it, when the time is right, when we have agreement, perhaps we can actually move towards an inclusive administration. But for the moment, this is named as being a caretaker and acting administration, but it is absolutely not inclusive. It is the most exclusive administration you could imagine.
Professor Michael Semple from Queen's University, Belfast, thanks very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Still to come on CGTN, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the United States is working with the Taliban to operate flights out of Kabul during crisis talks in Qatar. Stay with us.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back. And do remember that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
The Taliban's announcement of a new government comes as the UN issues a stark warning that Afghanistan is on the brink of a humanitarian crisis. Michael Voss reports.
The United Nations has warned that Afghanistan faces a humanitarian crisis and is appealing for $600 million to meet the war-torn country's immediate needs. More than 500,000 Afghans have been displaced this year, many living in tent camps around the capital, Kabul.
We understand the constraints the donors work under. They are looking urgently at options, to keep those health facilities open. But we are going to have a pause in operation in a large proportion of those. Probably, by some estimates, up to 90% will cease functioning probably later in the week.
The final province that was holding out against the Taliban has fallen, with images of Taliban fighters raising their flag over the administrative capital of Panjshir Valley. The head of the resistance there, Ahmad Massoud, says fighting continues and called for a national uprising against the Taliban. He accused Pakistan of supplying drones to bomb his positions. Universities have reopened. Women are able to attend, but they must now sit separately from male students, divided by curtains. Dozens of women took to the streets of Kabul on Monday demanding basic women's rights, amid fears the Taliban may reimpose the same harsh treatment as the last time it was in power. A larger, more general anti-Taliban and anti-Pakistan demonstration took place on Tuesday. This ended up in chaos, with Taliban gunmen shooting into the air, forcing people to run for cover.
The Islamic government is shooting at our poor people. The Taliban are very unjust. They do not give us the right to demonstrate. They are not Muslims, but infidels, as you can see by the situation we are in.
Meanwhile, the walls surrounding the deserted US embassy in Kabul have been transformed with paintings of Taliban flags and emblems, a reminder of just how swiftly the balance of power has changed. Michael Voss, CGTN.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin are in Qatar for talks on Afghanistan. Qatar helped America's evacuation of its citizens and allies from the country following the Taliban's takeover. Well, CGTN's Caroline Malone is covering the visit from Washington, D.C. So, Caroline, the Taliban has announced its interim government, and it seems the Interior Minister is wanted by the FBI.
Well, that's right. And we do know that the US has been negotiating with the Taliban already in order to try and get Americans remaining and Afghans with the right paperwork out of Afghanistan. And US officials have actually said that allowing these types of groups of people out is really a primary requirement for how they're going to assess what kind of ties they have with the Taliban going forward, no matter who's in that interim government. I mean, up for consideration is things such as whether the US will roll back sanctions on particular Taliban officials, whether the US will restart government aid to Afghanistan. Afghanistan traditionally had a lot of aid from the US in the past. And basically, the US is still considering whether it will normalize relations with the Taliban government, no matter who's in it. There's also, of course, wider requests for the Taliban to respect human rights, especially how that relates to women. We know that we were hearing there that women are, able to go back to school and work. But how that really plays out is key here. So we want to see going forward how the Taliban, the US wants to see how the Taliban will act, really, rather than what they're saying, especially now that we have that new information about the interim government, and that will be key in assessing the future US Taliban ties.
And meanwhile, Caroline, we've heard that 4 more US citizens have been evacuated from Afghanistan. How did they get out?
That's right. We know they safely departed Afghanistan, and we know that they actually took a land route out of the country, and that was facilitated by the US State Department. But it is unclear which border they crossed and actually where they are now. The US State Department's actually kept that quiet for the time being. potentially because this is really a new option for getting Americans out of Afghanistan, that they don't want to be threatened. I mean, since US troops withdrew and the Kabul airport is actually closed, that isn't an option at the time, for the time being. We know that news about the group came out from the US Secretary of State that you mentioned there, Antony Blinken, who's arrived in Qatar earlier today. He's been meeting with Qatari leaders and people that are coordinating evacuations and processing of people who are actually in Qatar, thousands there at the moment. He has confirmed that the US is in contact with the Taliban about getting other people out of Afghanistan. Let's hear a little bit more about what he had to say.
We've also been engaging with the Taliban on this topic, including in recent hours. They've said that they will let people with travel documents freely depart. We will hold them to that. So will dozens of other countries. The international community is watching to see if the Taliban will live up to their commitments.
But reports, though, that the Taliban is blocking other US citizens from leaving.
That's right. There are, we know, a number of planes in Mazar-Sharif, which is in northern Afghanistan, and there are people there who are wanting to get out, planes that are carrying potentially American citizens and other US permanent residents. And those planes haven't been able to take off yet. Reports from members of Congress here in the United States, they're saying it's turning into something of a hostage situation by the Taliban. However, Blinken has said that they are aware of a small group who are trying to get out from that airport. However, there's a wider concern of everyone on those flights having the right paperwork, and until they do, they can't get any of those planes out. And as we've heard, the US has been assured by the Taliban that Americans, Afghans with the right documents will be allowed out. So waiting to see what happens there. In the meantime, Qatari officials have expressed an interest in actually reopening the Kabul airport to international flights, which could potentially help get more people out in the future. But the security is still a concern in the capital. From Blinken's perspective, he said that around 100 Americans are still in Afghanistan and do want to still leave.
Caroline Malone in Washington, thank you.
For more on the newly announced interim Afghan government, CGTN's Naweed Jabakal joins us here in the studio. Naweed, some really familiar faces. Tell us more about these key figures in this government.
Yeah, lots of names being brandished about at the moment. Let's start with the big one then, the acting Prime Minister. He's Mullah Hassan Akhund. He is the political leader of the Taliban in recent years, has been heading a lot of their work in terms of their dealings in Qatar, and he was a close confidant, close to the Taliban leader, Mullah Omar, who died in 2013. So a figure that was quite popular in the resistance against the US-led invasion. His deputy is a person called Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who again was a key figure on the international stage, much more recognizable, did a lot of traveling to Doha, headed the political office there in Qatar. And before that, he was a key figure in the war in the 1990s and a co-founder of the original group dating back to the early 90s when the Afghan civil war and the Taliban took over the country in 1996. A couple of other key figures. We heard about Sirajuddin Haqqani there from Caroline. He's probably the most contentious one. He'll be the new acting interior minister. He's the son of a man called Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was involved in the resistance against the Soviet occupation going back to the 1980s. So as you can see, there's this muddling almost of previous conflicts of Afghanistan, which led to the rise of the Taliban, the resistance against the US, and now they're back in power. The problem with Haqqani, he's on a US foreign terror organization watch list, the group he heads, the Haqqani organization. The Taliban, the wider Taliban isn't on that, but the Haqqani network is, and it shows just how murky the group remains, at least in terms of its dealing with Western community and its dealings, its legitimacy with Western intelligence agencies. And then lastly, another key position worth mentioning is the acting defense minister. He's someone called Mullah Yaqub, the son of the aforementioned Mullah Omar, who headed the Taliban. A very low-profile figure Mullah Omar was, and he died in 2013. All four of these men, although their names have been in the news a lot because of President Trump's deal with the Taliban, in actual fact, pictures of them are hard to come by, and the Taliban leadership throughout the decades has been very, very low profile, despite its calls of inclusivity so far, which it did promise. This temporary cabinet is made up all of men. It's made up all of Pashtun figures, the main ethnic tribe, marginally by some percentage, and they're largely Islamist-oriented in their outlook. Now, Islamist-oriented into varying degrees, of course. Some are more moderate than others, but I think that's likely to raise a lot of questions, particularly for the Afghans, who some of them who may be unhappy with this announcement.
Well, I wanted to ask you a bit about that, actually. I wonder how Afghans will react to this news.
Yeah, well, there will be many who will be upset, I think, about this caretaker government. The Taliban has insisted that these are acting ministers. This is a caretaker government. This isn't permanent, this is temporary. Here's what Zabiullah Mujahid had to say. He said, "We know the people of our country have been waiting for a new government." Now, the people have been waiting for a government, but the one that's been offered today has no women in it. It has no major representation from other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, the likes of the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazaras. And if you look at Afghanistan's recent history with the conflicts in the past 4 decades, ethnic conflict has always been a key issue there. Aside from that, there isn't much representation of other religious groups as well, the likes of the Shias, who constitute almost 10% of the population in Afghanistan, so there are concerns there. The Taliban were asked about that in the press conference, and they kept on insisting, Zabiullah Mujahid, the spokesperson, saying that this is a temporary measure, these are acting ministers, and I think the priority for the Taliban at the moment appears to be stability, but as we've been seeing from the protests on the streets and from Michael's report earlier, there is still a lot of anger about the course the country is going on, particularly if you look at the cities in Afghanistan at the moment.
And what about the international community, Naweed? The likes of Sarajid and Haqqani potentially could rein in Al-Qaeda, or is this lineup likely to be more than disappointing for the West?
Yeah, I think well, the West are going to be looking at this, and as Caroline mentioned, they're going to have to think about some of those questions. For example, do they sanction the Taliban or do they not? Martin Griffiths, the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations for Humanitarian Relief, he went and met the Taliban, posted on Twitter yesterday. So these meetings are taking place. Anthony Blinken in Qatar at the moment meeting the Taliban. The UK's sent its special envoy last week for Afghanistan affairs. So these conversations are happening, and I think what Western countries are trying to do now is to decide they don't want to bestow legitimacy upon the Taliban. That's something that they're ruling out at this stage. But now, with the Taliban declaring this government in Afghanistan, there's going to have to be some acceptance of the reality on the ground. But the key question is trying to stabilize things at the moment. There are other threats for the Taliban in Afghanistan. If you look at the Islamic State's Khorasan province, that's one area. You mentioned Al-Qaeda. So far, there's been a tendency to try and publicly, at least, distance themselves from Al-Qaeda. But I think the priority is going to be trying to offer security to the Afghan people. And I mentioned the cities. There's a lot of resistance in the cities. We've heard reports of possible deaths today in Herat. We saw ourselves in Kabul. There were live fire ammunition by some members, what appeared to be members of the Taliban, shooting up in the sky. But remember, this is a country, more than 70% of the country lives in rural areas, so there may be some support for the Taliban, particularly those rural areas which have seen a barrage of warfare under the US-led coalition in the past 20 years. So what's happening in the cities is a microcosm of wider Afghanistan, but it's going to be a really, really difficult country to govern, particularly in the next few months, and especially with this humanitarian crisis looming, which the UN is continuously warning about.
Naweed Jabalkar, thanks very much.
Thanks, Naweed. Well, still to come on CGTN, why the coup in Guinea has sent aluminium prices soaring, and what this could mean for the cost of cars.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
Roger, repeat last clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very busy when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live it out.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Paul Barber and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. 3 weeks after taking Kabul, the Taliban announces its acting government.
And Taliban security forces fire in the air to disperse Kabul protests against the Taliban and Pakistani interference. China has announced a surprise surge in exports and imports in August. Imports surged 33.1% compared with a year earlier, while exports jumped 25.6%, led by strong overseas demand for cars, electronics and consumer goods. The total value of trade in both directions in the first 8 months of the year came in at around $3.8 trillion, an increase of nearly 24% compared with the same period last year. The ASEAN region remained China's largest trading partner, followed by the EU and the United States.
Markets were expecting China's export and import growth to moderate in August due to port congestion and COVID outbreaks. Senior fellow at the China Association of International Trade, Li Yong, explains why the reality was different.
First is because of the strong demand from all the major trading partners like ASEAN countries, EU, United States, and Japan. You know, all those four partners accounted for nearly 47% of the total trade. So import and export from those partners have increased. And secondly, I think it is because of the concern of the port disruption or congestion that some of the buyers are, stocking the products for the shopping season that is going to come, I think, in the next half of the year. And thirdly, I think the alternative sourcing of supplies from other countries have come back to China. That is mainly because of the impact of the pandemic in some of the countries. And of course, we cannot rule out the price factor.
China is planning to expand one of its flagship economic areas in the south, known as the Greater Bay Area. The Qianhai Economic Zone in Shenzhen will increase by about 8 times to more than 120 square kilometres. It's currently roughly 15 square kilometres. The expansion is part of a plan to further integrate Hong Kong and Macau's economies into the Greater Bay Area by encouraging more investment, trade and currency exchange across the borders.
World stocks hit fresh record highs on Tuesday, buoyed by speculation that the US Federal Reserve will put off tapering on its bond purchases for the time being. But when Wall Street opened, it fell sharply over worries the Delta variant might affect the reopening of the economy. John Terrace is live for us in New York. Hello, John. What's going on?
Paul and Robin, it's always the way. You make a decision 5 hours out and then the markets do the complete opposite about what you think they're going to do. I mean, the story is that in Asia, we had green across the board today. The Nikkei, the Hang Seng, Shanghai, the All Ords over in Sydney, all in the green. I noticed the Korean market wasn't in the green, but the others all were. China figures we just reported on. The fact it was Labor Day on Monday here, so they had no steerage from the United States. All of that contributing to that. And we thought we would go into the green today as well after big falls on Friday, but it wasn't to be, and the markets are pretty much, with the exception of the NASDAQ, which I'll tell you about in a second, have been down since we opened about 3 hours ago. And the reason, as you rightly identify, is ongoing concerns about the Delta variant and others coming along, and also the fact that this weekend certain benefits have been ending that have been propping people up financially since the COVID era began. We'll get to that in more detail in just a second. But, of course, all this comes off the back of a terrible jobs report when the markets fell very heavily on Friday. Awful jobs report, really. I don't know how the economists could have got it so wrong. We created 200,000 new jobs in North America in August, and they'd been expecting 700,000 or more. So that was a really big miss. President Biden blamed the Delta variant. And as you also say, the reason the markets were in the green around the world is the assumption that the Federal Reserve tapering of the $120 billion asset buying that's been going on here to prop up the U.S. economy, that tapering has been postponed because of that jobs report. So what do we have going on? At the moment, then, the Dow is down 0.7%, but the NASDAQ is ahead by 1/5%. And this is because Apple has just announced a big day on September the 14th when it's likely to announce a brand new iPhone, we are told. And then the S&P 500 is also down like the Dow by about 1/3%. So that's where we're at the moment. Worth noting, I think, that both the NASDAQ and the S&P are up about 20%, though, since the beginning of the year. Paul and Robin?
And, John, millions of Americans have now lost unemployment assistance, haven't they?
Yes. Yes. Well, this is the other thing. This is the thing that people not living here, I think, probably don't understand, because Labor Day was a major public holiday yesterday, Monday, and that was the deadline for the cutting off of an awful lot of people, about 10 million people in one way or another around the country, from the unemployment assistance that they've been having since the Delta since COVID-19 began in about March, give or take March of 2020. So I'll name them for what it's worth. One is called the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. The other one is the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. Those have ended now, and the states around the country, some of them have been ending their own unemployment insurance gradually over the last couple of months. So now it's pretty much all gone nationwide. And just to help you understand very quickly, people who don't have a job as a vocation or a career, who are literally just going to work to make money for their families, they have been, and there's tons of proof of this now, they've been getting more money in various concessions and assistance from the states and the federal government than they could ever make on a monthly basis at their job. So they haven't bothered to go back to work. They've stayed with their families, or we're told in many cases have started doing online educational courses to get a better job once they've qualified from those. So that has literally been going on. But Biden says he's now satisfied with the health of the U.S. economy, and he thinks everybody can stop taking these benefits and find a job. There are 10 million of them open at the moment, and economists are certainly expecting a big job spike in October. We shall see. Guys?
We shall indeed. John Terretts, thank you very much.
The cars of the future are back on display in Germany. The world-famous IAA Auto Show has returned as a live in-person event for the first time since the pandemic started.
And as correspondent Ryan Thompson reports from Munich, it's all about electric, but there could be challenges ahead.
It's been nearly 2 years since the world's up-and-coming cars shined under the bright lights. But after a coronavirus hiatus, Germany's world-famous auto showcase is back. Mercedes presented its luxurious EQS. BMW highlighted the engine power inside the new iX. But the real star of the show all around, electric engines.
This year's auto show is a stark change from the past. It's clear that internal combustion engines are out, and greener and cleaner mobility is very much in. 38 new electric vehicles are on display from some of the world's biggest automakers, including Volkswagen, who are showcasing how they will modernize their fleets over the next 5 years.
Actually getting there will be no easy feat. It's complicated by evolving European Union laws, a challenging supply chain transition, and ensuring that the vehicles of the future match the power of the past. Volkswagen's CEO was pressed whether the brand could accelerate its transition to electric, but said it was impossible. Brands like Daimler and BMW were facing similar questions and possible legal action from environmental groups. They say that they're not worried.
Our ambition 2039 is all about being CO2 neutral, net zero in all dimensions, supply chain, our own operations, of course the product, but also the product in use. 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement, which is a very aggressive target for the whole business system. Now we're accelerating the product side of this, and we're going to put the company in a position whereby, for the product portfolio, we can go all electric by the end of the decade.
It's not just European automakers who are hoping to impress motorheads in Munich. Chinese car makers have designed impressive EV fleets at home, and now they're hoping to extend their sales into Europe. Brands like Way and Aura plan to launch on the continent by the middle of next year.
You don't have just like 3, 4, 5 players in the market anymore. There's just so much innovation going on, and the world is developing that fast. And this is why a Chinese origin auto manufacturer makes total sense, because they're so developed digitally and they find a very good innovative solution to other problems. So there's absolutely any kind of legitimacy to be here.
But these two brands will join a crowded field that's filled with other Chinese EV automakers that are vying for European customers' loyalty. The hope among all is that they can win over enough climate-conscious customers before European competitors make a full green transition. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Munich.
The soldiers who staged the coup in Guinea have consolidated their power by naming the military officers to run the country's regions and districts. The coup has been condemned by the United Nations and the Economic Community of West African States, who are holding an extraordinary summit on the situation and threatening sanctions. President Alpha Condé, who was serving a disputed third term, was overthrown on Sunday, and the leader of the country's opposition has welcomed the change, describing it as an opportunity for a new beginning and calling for the army to bring national conciliation.
Well, one impact from the coup is the soaring cost of aluminium. The uncertain political situation has led to the highest prices in a decade, hitting over $2,700 a tonne on the London Metal Exchange. Shares in production companies in China and Russia also shot up. So why is Guinea so key to the production of this metal? I spoke to Nitesh Shah, a global economist and director of research at Wisdom Tree, to find out.
Yeah, so Guinea is the world's second largest producer of bauxite, which is a key ingredient for aluminium production. So any stoppage of bauxite leaving the country to the producers of aluminium will severely disrupt the production of aluminium and is already leading to price increases.
So how seriously are global producers taking this?
So, producers are going to be affected. There's no real way around it. There are other producing countries like Australia. So the largest aluminium producer, which is China, will have to rely more on Australia for its supplies. But the question is whether Australia can ramp up production and get it out into China quick enough. And also there's the political landscape to also look out for there as well, with some restrictions of exports already in place globally, that some of those have to just be dismantled to be able to get over this hump.
And we're seeing prices of aluminium at 10-year highs. So how much of that is down to what's happening in Guinea, and how much is due to other factors?
Yeah, so that's a great observation. I mean, aluminium prices were already rising pretty sharply before the coup occurred in Guinea, and part of that's due to the fact that aluminium production is quite energy intense, and especially in China, where a lot of the aluminium is produced using coal as the energy feedstock. Now, with China having set its sights on becoming net neutral in terms of emissions by the middle of this century, China had already started to reduce some of its production activity. So the tightness in the market had already started to present itself. At the same time, demand has already started to increase. Aluminium is a nice lightweight metal, and it's quite great for putting into machinery to make them lighter and therefore use less energy when using the machinery, things like cars, for example. So while demand was going up, supply was coming down, that shot prices up already, and this is just exacerbating, the coup in Guinea is exacerbating the problem.
As you say, demand for aluminium high. It's used in manufacturing so many things. Who's set to be most affected by this?
I think, any user of aluminium, so whether we talk about the can industry, soft drinks industry, but also, some of the heavier users of aluminium in the transport industry, for example, with that transition to more lightweighting cars, but also aeroplanes. Any user of a material that has this kind of flexibility of being light, and those who are trying to use the material to reduce their kind of overall energy expenditure or carbon footprint, I think those will be affected.
And will we see the high price of aluminium passed on to consumers?
Yeah, I think it's very likely for the pass on of these costs. We've seen it in other industries, for example, in the semiconductor industry, with that shortage of semiconductors, we've already started to see car prices rise quite substantially. Even the availability of cars has diminished quite a lot, and we expect those cost pass-ons to be replicated in the aluminium industry. As those input prices go up, they're most likely to be passed on to the consumer.
Germany's biggest finance company is under investigation over the demise of some of its US investment funds. Regulators have launched a probe into Allianz following billions of dollars worth of losses last year. Officials are believed to be looking into whether company executives had knowledge of any events related to the crash. The German insurer is one of the world's biggest money managers, with almost $3 trillion in assets.
Deutsche Telekom is strengthening its transatlantic focus with a $7 billion share swap deal with SoftBank. The German company will receive 45 million of SoftBank's shares in T-Mobile US in exchange for a 4.5% stake in its business, plus cash. The telecom operator is also selling its Dutch unit and investing some of the proceeds to buy further shares in T-Mobile US, with both deals helping to raise its overall stake to over 48%.
The UK has been forced to fire up an old coal power plant in order to meet its electricity needs. Britain has seen energy prices hit a record high, while the amount of electricity coming from its wind farms has dropped dramatically due to calm weather. Shortages across Europe and increased demand from Asia have seen the cost of gas rise to its highest level on record.
The UK has unveiled plans for tax increases worth more than $16.5 billion a year to fix its health and social care funding crisis. Breaking an election promise not to raise taxes, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced that workers, employers and some investors will be impacted from next April. The proceeds will tackle healthcare backlogs due to COVID-19 and fund care for the elderly.
The European Commission has asked Europe's top court to impose a daily fine on Poland until it complies with an earlier order to suspend a disciplinary tribunal to oversee the work of judges. It comes amid EU concerns about the independence of Poland's judiciary.
Still to come on CGTN, warnings of a biodiversity crisis as the World Conservation Congress meets in Marseille.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
fight against poverty has suffered a setback.
We are at a turning point in history.
It's a world under great distress and disruption.
But solving the crisis is still possible.
Change is indeed coming.
Join me, Stephen Cole, for a special one-hour-long show here on CGTN, where we speak to some of the world's top leaders and experts standing on the front line of the fight against poverty.
It's a real mistake to think that the future is decided for us. We need dialogue.
We'll spark debate.
The biggest challenge is addressing inequality.
We'll explore the solutions.
This can be done, but it requires everybody working together.
And we'll showcase the success stories to reveal how the cycle of poverty can be broken. Innovation, action, change. Only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Contenders are coming forward to replace Japan's Yoshihide Suga as leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party.
The two frontrunners are seen as a choice between business as usual or a younger, more outspoken approach. And with the winner all but certain to be Japan's next Prime Minister, the race is heating up. Terence Terashima reports from Tokyo.
Some analysts say it was a miscalculation by Yoshihide Suga. They say the Japanese Prime Minister felt confident in his influence on the party and his chances to run for a second term. But Suga's approval ratings are at an all-time low. This is largely due to his government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and pushing ahead with the Summer Olympics, while Japan's cases rose to record levels. Many LDP party members called for a change in leadership. Analysts say, seeing little chances of victory, Suga decided to step down. Opinion polls suggest Taro Kono as public favorite to replace Suga. Kono is Japan's administrative reform minister and is in charge of overseeing Japan's COVID vaccination program. Two other top contenders include former Defense Minister Shigeru Ishiba and former Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida. With the general election around the corner, many legislators say they want to back a candidate with the most public support.
Given the low approval ratings, younger legislators are desperate to survive the election, so they will vote for whoever will allow them to survive. Unlike when Suga was elected a year ago, there will be no faction votes.
Experts say policies for the two front-runners for the party leadership, Kishida and Kono, are very different.
Mr. Kishida is a moderate politician and can expect to continue most of the current policies. But if Mr. Kono wins the election, I expect a change. He's young and aggressive. I expect him to carry out deregulations and face other challenges, such as policies of Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry. So people with vested interest in the current policies might vote against him.
Political haggling is expected to intensify as more LDP candidates are expected to raise their hands for the race within the week. The official election will start on September 17th and ballots will be counted on the 29th. After the LDP president is elected, the ruling party will call for a special legislative session to choose Japan's new prime minister. Terence Terashima, CGTN, Tokyo.
The world is facing a biodiversity crisis, but there's still time for policymakers to make the changes needed. That was the message from Ma Keping, a leading botanist at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, who was speaking to CGTN on the sidelines of the World Conservation Congress in Marseille, France. Ross Cullen reports.
The world knows what is causing the climate and biodiversity crises and has started to address them. That was the message from Keping Ma. He's the Secretary General of the Biodiversity Committee at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, also the Asia Regional Chair at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And we're here at the IUCN's World Conservation Congress. Keping Ma was addressing the Hybrid Summit online, and he laid out to us what he thinks needs to happen to lessen the impact of climate change and of biodiversity loss.
By enhancing protection efforts, by restoration of ecosystems, and also by translational change, refers to sustainable production and sustainable consumption, and also try to fight against impacts of climate change. And when we do all of these, it is hopeful to mitigate climate change and in the same time to bend the curve of biodiversity loss.
China has had some success in species conservation, setting up tiger reserves and monitoring the critically endangered Hainan black-crested gibbon. But some Chinese animals are also being lost. The giant paddlefish and the Baiji river dolphin going extinct in recent years due to overfishing, habitat loss and water pollution.
We really have successful cases for the conservation of terrestrial ecosystems. And we also the associated animals such as ibis, tiger, giant panda, Tibetan antelope, and so on. But for the inland water ecosystems, and we really are facing more challenges. And the major problem, I think, is the impacts of human activities.
Keping Ma also touched on the upcoming COP15 talks on biodiversity, which are going to be held in Kunming in China in October. Now, Kunming is the capital city of Yunnan province, which is home to thousands of species of plants and animals. But he underlined the importance of not just protecting animals, but also conserving plants and trees.
Plants are nearly the only living things who can fix solar energy, and then other living things could depend on the energy plants produce. So that's a very important function of biodiversity. And if we do not have that kind of energy, the whole living world will disappear.
This conference marks another stepping stone on the path to COP26 in November, when heads of government are going to meet to discuss the climate emergency. Keping Ma says there urgently needs to be international collaboration on a viable climate plan and also a mechanism to be able to implement such a plan, or else the planet faces a very bleak future. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Marseille.
And the headlines again. 3 weeks after taking Kabul, the Taliban announces its acting government.
Taliban security forces fire in the air to disperse Kabul protests against the Taliban and Pakistani interference.
And China reports record imports and exports, easing fears a shipping shortage would slow economic recovery.
And that is Global Business Europe. Thank you so much for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps like Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. We're also on YouTube and Dailymotion, and of course CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.